Thank you to everyone who's tuning in from all over the world for this special conversation. My name is Anis Modi, and I'm part of the team behind Highflix. For those of you who don't know us yet and do not subscribe, Highflix is a streaming platform dedicated to Jewish content. We have thousands of hours of the best TV shows, films, documentaries, everything that you'd like to watch from across the Jewish world, Israel included, of course. We bring that right to your screen. And we are in for a fascinating conversation about Israeli politics today. We are joined by Anshel Pfeffer, who's reporting to us from Israel. Hi, Anshel. How are you today?
Hi, Anis. Thank you for having me.
So I should say evening, right? Where in Israel are you right now?
I'm in Jerusalem, and yes, it's 10:30 in the evening here.
Yeah, so just to give a little bit of a background to our audience tuning in, Anshel is a senior correspondent and a columnist at Haaretz and the Israel correspondent for The Economist. He has covered a wide range of topics, including security, religion, and international affairs for over 25 years, and has reported from over 40 countries on 5 continents. And this is the 5th election cycle, if I'm not mistaken, in just under 4 years in Israel, correct?
Oh, the 5th election in one long cycle, yes.
Yeah, it's. I'm sure you're getting tired on the professional and the personal level to some degree, isn't it?
It's a bit repetitive, and it is an election which I think every one of these elections there is a lot at stake, and obviously having to cover it is it's a bit tiring, but that's what we do.
Yeah, of course. So just to add another fun tidbit, Anshel's book, Bibi, The Turbulent Life and Times of Benjamin Netanyahu, is a biography of the perennial candidate, of which we are about to discuss very much in depth about. It was published in English in 2018 in the United States, Canada, and the UK. So Anshel, the election system in Israel is a little bit different than what we have here in the US. And obviously we have the midterms elections coming on and so on. So before we dive into, the details, the polls are opening tomorrow. I was wondering if you can give our audience just a general explanation of just how the election system works and how the parliamentary system that we inherited from the British works, and just to give them a little bit of a general idea of what's going to happen.
Actually, the election system is pretty simple. It's, visualize Israel as one district or one constituency. Everybody votes for a list of candidates, and and that's it. It's a proportional representation. There's no direct voting for specific candidates. There's no preferential votes in which you can rank your voting. You just put one ballot into the box, and that is for a party, and the number of votes for the parties are calculated on a proportional level using a rather complex mathematics system, but that's for wonks. But basically, it's pretty simple. And the reason that it's so simple is that it was never really planned. So back at the end of 1948, Israel was still during the Independence War, and the state, which had been founded just a few months earlier, was about to hold its first election. The election wasn't supposed to be it was supposed to be a one-off election because they were voting for a constitutional assembly, not just for a new parliament. This was supposed to be the assembly which would draft the new Israeli constitution. The new constitution would have in it also a more elaborate, a more well thought out voting system. But the first Knesset, the first Israeli parliament, failed at its role as a constitutional assembly. They didn't manage to draft. There was too many disagreements. They failed to draft a constitution. And as I'm sure many of our viewers know, to this day, Israel doesn't have a constitution. And basically, Israel is stuck with that electoral system that was agreed upon in a short meeting one night between David Ben-Gurion, who was at the time the temporary prime minister, and Shapiro, who was the temporary justice minister. They decided upon this in a short evening meeting at Shapiro's apartment, and that was it. And with a
Very
few,
interesting.
with a few tinkerings, the main tinkering is that they've risen what's called the threshold. In other words, the minimum number of votes a party needs to get just to get into the Knesset and win seats to 3.25% of the vote. It used to be just 1%, and in a couple of changes, they moved it up gradually to 3.25. That's really the only major change to the electoral system. And what it means is that you have a lot of small parties in the Knesset. In the outgoing Knesset, we had the 13 parties of different sizes, and no party has ever won an all-right majority because many people have the option to vote for small parties that they feel represent them, represent their community, their special interests. So there's never been in all of Israeli history one party with an outright majority. So every government is by necessity a coalition government. Every government. So after every election, there's a period in which the different parties have this kind of this horse trading, and until a majority is there. Sometimes it takes a few days, sometimes it takes weeks or months, and people have said a lot of things about the Israeli political system, about its stability, about the system not being that great. I disagree, because until 2019, Israel managed to have on average an election every 3 years and a few months. So it's not as if there was an election every day, and every election managed to deliver a clear winner, not one winner because there's never one party, but a clear coalition. Leader of one of the largest parties formed a coalition and became prime minister, with the exception of 1984, when there was a virtual tie between the parties supporting Likud and the parties supporting Labour. And even then, they basically arrived at a power sharing agreement whereby Labour's Shimon Peres and Likud's Yitzhak Shamir split the term between them. It delivered result. It delivered a result. The result was accepted. People respect the outcome. There was little feeling within Israel until very recently that the results could be in any way fraudulent, and all this ran aground in 2019 because of the man we're talking about right now, Bibi Netanyahu. And the reason for that is that once Netanyahu became the subject of a police investigation and then was indicted and charged in court, the center left and some of the right wing as well said, we can't sit under a prime minister who's charged with corruption. Now, there is no actual law in Israel saying that you can't serve as prime minister if you're indicted, but until Netanyahu, whenever that seemed to be the case, the prime minister resigned. So we had Yitzhak Rabin, who in 1977 was investigated for breaking what was then the currency laws of Israel, and he resigned. You had Ehud Olmert, who was charged with bribery and eventually went to prison for that, resigning when the allegations arose. And then you had Netanyahu, who himself, back in the days when Olmert was the prime minister, had said very clearly that there's no way that a prime minister can continue to serve and to make decisions for the entire nation when they're the subject of a criminal investigation. Suddenly, when he became the subject of the criminal investigation, he said, "No way! This is against the will of the people, and the people get to decide. And this is a witch hunt, and I'm the and these cases have been tailored against me, and so on." And what we've ended up with in Israel is half the country basically agreeing with Netanyahu that the courts and the legal system and the prosecutors shouldn't have the power to indict a prime minister and therefore force him to resign. So if he's their democratic choice, then who are these prosecutors to say otherwise? And another half of the country, and you could probably work it out as slightly more than half of the country, but still roughly half of the country say, no, we don't think Netanyahu can continue to serve, and we will. And this half of the country votes for parties who are refusing to sit with Netanyahu. Now, the big problem is that even if there's a slight majority supporting the anti-Netanyahu position that he can't serve, this majority is not a coalition. They are very, very disparate parties ranging from right-wing to center, left-wing, and Arab and Islamist parties. And until June of last year, these parties failed to get their act together and form one coalition with the majority of the Knesset, until Yair Lapid, who is now the prime minister, managed to cobble together a majority, a coalition. And the only way he could do that, he could make all these very different parties sit together, was to actually give up his own right to be prime minister, despite being leader of the largest party in this bloc, and basically saying to Naftali Bennett, leader of the right-wing part, of the small right-wing party, look, if you join us, you can be prime minister for 2 years, and then I'll take over. And that is what basically allowed the coalition to come into. It's a very small coalition with the smallest of majorities, and it didn't last for more than a year, which is why we're back right now where we are with this election. And once again, the polls are saying the same thing.
Yeah, back to square one for the fifth time, right?
Back to square one the fifth time, and the polls say we're split down the middle. And if Netanyahu wins, it'll be by a sliver of the vote. And if he loses, it'll be by a sliver of the vote. And if he loses, it's unclear whether anybody can form a coalition. So we're where we were. Netanyahu is just 2 weeks ago turned 73. So he's a young man with a
very
future.
Vibrant 73, I would say.
Yeah, but I went to one of his election rallies on Thursday, and I wish, I'm 24 years younger than him. I wish I had that energy. So he's going to carry on going. Half of Israelis are going to oppose him, and we're in this vicious, never-ending cycle of elections. God knows for how longer.
Yeah, so I actually saw an article that you've published today in a publication called Unheard in English, and I just wanted to not gloss over a few of the details and to just backstep a little bit. So you wrote that in June 2021, the opposition parties managed to come together in a bizarre coalition. These are your words: bizarre coalition of nationalists, centrists, left-wingers, and conservative Islamists, cobbled together by columnist and chat show host Yair Lapid, which finally ejected Netanyahu from the prime minister's office. So my question is, and a lot of our audience as well, and it's a question that we've gotten from our audience when we made it available to them to send in questions for this interview, is there a clear ideological divide between the Bibi and the Rak Lo Bibi side of the campaign, which is Rak Lo Bibi translating to just not Bibi?
No, there isn't a clear ideological divide, though there is a matter of principle. And I said it before, I think that standing by the principle that someone who is charged with serious corruption shouldn't serve as prime minister, and should at the very least take a time out from politics and allow someone else to lead his own party, even if it's on a caretaker basis. That to me is a fundamental principle. People can oppose that principle, but that is something which does. You don't have to call it. You can call it ideology, because there is a matter here of accountability, of rule of law, of the fact that politicians should also have to give an account for serious allegations against them. So yes, I think there is something ideological about it, but it's true that if we didn't have this issue of Netanyahu, then there is very little keeping these, bringing these people together besides that. So,
and what about
I mean, I wish I could give a better answer to that question, because
No,
it's a
of
problem.
course, yeah.
The reason why this coalition only lasted for 1 year, and even if Netanyahu doesn't get a majority in the election, it's hard to see another similar coalition coming about. But there is a major matter of principle here.
And what about the flip side of that coin? All of the parties, the different parties that are lining up behind Netanyahu, what is their so-called the agenda, if you can call it that?
So these parties are certainly more cohesive on an ideological level. They're not identical. Two of them are ultra-Orthodox parties, Shas and Torah Judaism, and they themselves have differences between them. One represents the Ashkenazi Haredi community, what the other represents a more Mizrahi traditional community. Then you've got Likud itself, which is the old right-wing party of Israel, and Likud has undergone some changes as well in recent years, both as a result of Netanyahu pushing them in a certain direction, and also a result of them feeling this sort of alliance with the ultra-Orthodox party. So it's essentially a secular party, but it has a lot of religious people in it, and its members are kind of showing an increasing level of affinity with the ultra-Orthodox. And then there's a new-ish party. And when I say party, it could be misleading, because in Israel, a party is a political entity. What is actually running in the election is a list. So a list of candidates could represent a number of parties, or a party could be fielding two lists of candidates. It's not necessarily the same thing. So when I talk about parties, I'm usually referring to the lists running in the election, but some of these lists are a number of parties merged, and the fourth party, or the fourth list that I'm referring to, calls itself Religious Zionism, and it's basically a relatively new, I mean, it ran already in the previous election in 2021, but it's a relatively new grouping of three smaller far-right parties. One is called National Union, which is led by Bezalel Smotrich, and it's a very religious and very right-wing, very nationalist party. Another one is a small homophobic party called Noam. And the most interesting and the most talked about now element in the religious Zionist is the party called Jewish Power, led by Itamar Ben-Gvir.
It sounds really bad in English, right? I don't know how it sounds in Hebrew, but in English it sounds really bad.
It sounds bad in English, and exactly for the connotations that it makes, because it is a party which I think can be called a Jewish supremacist party. And look, we have different. You say it sounds bad in English. In different countries, we have different sensitivities. Israel is less politically correct and less liberal than the United States and some other Western countries. It has its liberal enclaves, and there are many, many other countries of the world which are less liberal than Israel. But this idea of a party saying, we are here to make clear that Jews run this place, and the Arabs should keep to their not have any real influence, political or social or whatever, is the idea of Jewish power. Now, it's a party which is an evolution of an American group, which was originally the JDL, the Jewish Defense League. Rabbi Meir Kahana, who founded it, emigrated in the 1970s from America to Israel, and then in Israel he founded the Kach Party, which never really grew. It was always a very, very small party. It once, in 1984, it won a single Knesset seat. Back then, the threshold was actually quite lower than it is today. At some point, it was also forbidden to run in the election, and even made an illegal movement and proscribed as a terror organization at the time. And what Itamar Ben-Gvir and some of his colleagues have done is they've found various legal ways to kind of tone down parts of the party's platform and rebrand it. It's still a very radical party, but it's managed to remain within the legal parameters so it can run. And even when it ran in recent elections, it was still too small to cross the threshold, until Netanyahu came along before the last election in 1921 and said, 2021. And so, I mentioned the electoral threshold. One of the things that happens is that a lot of small parties run in the election and don't cross the threshold, and therefore their votes aren't counted. And Netanyahu wanted to try and make sure that he could get a majority. So he wanted to sweep up every little splinter of a party. One of those parties was Jewish Power, because people weren't voting for Jewish Power because, people weren't voting for Jewish Power for whatever reason. Maybe they were ashamed to do so. Maybe they didn't agree with it. Maybe they thought it would never cross the threshold. Anyway, but Netanyahu forced these three parties to merge: Jewish Power, National Union, and Noam.
So the right-wing parties, right?
Gave Ben Gvir's Jewish Power party a sort of a stamp of approval, saying, they're okay. They can be part of my coalition. And let's remember, back in the day of Rabbi Kahana, the founder of this movement in the 1980s, Likud totally boycotted and ostracized him. And whenever he would get up in his single Knesset term, whenever he went up to the lectern to give a speech, all the Likud Knesset members, but including Likud, left the Knesset hall and wouldn't give him any kind of recognition. Now he is officially a partner of Likud, and that has released a floodgate, because, as I think we've seen in various countries around the world, including in the US, that when a very radical candidate comes along, who normally you wouldn't think that person would get any significant a number of voters, but if something happens to give that person, to give that candidate, and it could be a candidate for the Senate or Congress or even for the White House, a certain level of plausibility, of respectability within the mainstream, even if the mainstream media is treating him like a freak, but if they're still giving him presence and some level of credibility, that makes people who you may not think that they would vote for such a party or for such a candidate, it gives them the plausibility, it gives them license to do that. And we're seeing now in the polls a very worrying trend in which Ben Gvir, the whole list called religious Zionism, but Ben Gvir is certainly the main factor which is moving them and giving them popularity in a certain part of Israeli society. We're seeing them gaining traction, and that's
so it's an interesting
it's very worrying.
And it's an interesting point that you made about those type of candidates having some sort of stamp of approval from others, whether it's other candidates or the media. And we have a lot of politically inclined people here in the US and people tuning in, and I'm a New York Times subscriber. I was leafing through this New York Times Sunday editions a couple of days ago, and there was an article about Itamar Ben Gvir. So I was wondering if you could tell us just a little bit more about him and what's his secret of success. Because like you said, he's right-wing in his opinions, even right-wing for a lot of Israelis, and then suddenly he's in the Washington Post and he's in the New York Times. So what exactly happened there?
Well, don't forget, the reason that we're talking about Ben Gvir and he's getting profiled by papers like the Times and the Post is also because he is the phenomena of this election. We're talking about newspapers which cover Israel quite intensively. This is the fifth election in 4 years. He's the new thing. He's the flavor of the month. He's the story
of the month, exactly.
Not necessarily. He's not going to be prime minister tomorrow, and if he'll do really well, he'll get 10% of the vote, and that's much more than anybody expected. But it still doesn't make him a large party. But why is this? Why is he suddenly a thing? I mean, the real question is, why did other followers of Kahana fail to do what he's done? Because Kahana was assassinated, if memory serves, I think late 1990 or 1991. He was assassinated in New York, and in the years after, following the Hebron massacre and also Rabin's murder, and the movement that he founded, Kach, it split between various followers, and then it was outlawed, and it kind of fell on really bad times. It was seen as the furthest fringe of radicalism, and it didn't have many followers, certainly not openly. And Ben Gvir, who was at the time one of its youngest members, and I don't think he ever actually met Kahana, he was seen for many years as this young thug, was uncouth figure, moving around Jerusalem and Kiryat Arba, where he lives, and not really with a group of kids, really. It's kind of like a Lord of the Flies kind of figure. And suddenly he's metamorphosed, and we're seeing how he's built that I think in a very, very clever way. I mean, first of all, he fought to go to law school. And even though the Israeli Bar Association didn't want to give him a license to practice, he went to the Supreme Court and he forced them to allow him to practice as a lawyer. He became the lawyer of far-right suspects of violence and terror attacks and so on. But what he basically did was he agreed to work within the system. Even though he's very radical, even though he wants to bring the system down, by becoming a lawyer, by appearing in court, he gained a level of also respectability in a way, also kind of learned how to play by the rules. And gradually he also became a very savvy media performer. And I think that's really what changed. At some point, I think producers and interviewers and journalists kind of found him as a character who would always have an interesting line, who would always just know how to put the sound bites. Even though these are far right and radical things, he made them interesting. He gave a voice to this part of Israeli politics. And at some point, I think it was also a matter of rating. I think television producers and executives saw that when he's on the show, they bring in rating. And ultimately, even before Netanyahu could have kind of brought him in, he was already gaining a much higher level of acceptability. It was still low. In the last time he ran in an election on his own, I think it was 2019 or 2020, he failed to cross the threshold. However, he was already becoming a national figure. And when Netanyahu brought him in, Netanyahu did not for one moment think that he was causing this nationwide phenomena. He thought he was just making sure that those votes that Ben Gvir was getting wouldn't be lost to the right-wing camp. But once he brought him in, that kind of broke the barrier. Suddenly, it became okay. Now, if you're a Likudnik, you vote for Likud, and you want Bibi Netanyahu to be the prime minister. But basically, the message coming out was that it's okay to vote for Ben Gvir and for his party because they'll support Netanyahu anyway. And not only will they support Netanyahu, they are staunch nationalists, even more than some of the people in Likud. And for some Likudniks and for some voters of other right-wing parties, this was something very attractive.
Interesting. And then switching very, very sharply from the right wing to the left wing, as many of us know, there's a number of Arab parties that run in the elections pretty consistently. They ran under the banner of the joint list in a few of the past elections. Now there's a few separate Arab parties, and of course there's voices, in the Israeli right and the Israeli center even that have called the Israeli Arab parties as illegitimate, or that they hold positions that are outside of the Israeli political norms. So what could you tell us about them and what their lux might be in this coming election?
So the Arab parties is an entire cosmos to itself, and they have their internal dynamics within the Arab community, different parties there, and they have their relationships with the rest of Israeli politics. And what we've seen happening over the last 10 years in Arab politics is that there was, on the one hand, a movement towards trying to consolidate the different parties into one list. And I said before that it's important to understand the difference between lists and parties. So there were four main, and there still are, four main Arab political parties. One is Hadash, which is the old Communist Party, and they kind of make an issue of that they're also a party for Arabs and Jews, but the number of Jewish members and voters is really, really small. So it's basically, this is the old communist Arab Palestinian party. Then you have Ra'am, or United Arab List, as they're also called, which is the main Islamist party. So they're Islamist in the sense that they're religious, they're serious about their religion, but they still run in the Israeli elections. So they're not the extreme part of the Muslim community in Israel. Also, where there's Arab and there's Muslims, Hadash always has a significant membership of Arab Christians in it. There's Ta'al, which you could say is the party of the Arab bourgeoisie, so the middle class party, led by Ahmed Tibi, who is a very well-known veteran Arab Israeli politician, was in the past also an advisor to Yasser Arafat, leader of the Palestinian leader. And there's Balad, which is sort of the Arab Palestinian nationalist party. So each of these parties has different ideology. Each of them have different smaller communities and tribes and groups within the wider Arab Israeli community supporting them. And one of the things that happened was in 2013, the threshold was raised to 3.5%, and that jeopardized these parties. It meant that most of these parties would fall under the threshold if they ran separately. And that's why in 2015 we had what's called the joint list. Now, the joint list is seen as being the Arab party, but it was always a group of different Arab parties who were in rivalry, and they were never really united. Hence the name joint list. It's just the list. It's not a merger of actual parties, but they ran together because they knew that if they ran separately, their chances of crossing the threshold were low, and also they thought they could maximize their representation this way, and it did work. And the representation went up, and at its peak in 2020, it got as high as 15 seats, which is the highest representation Arab Israelis ever had. However, the tensions within the joint list meant that it wouldn't stay joint for long. And besides all the differences of ideologies I've already mentioned, there is one main issue that in recent years has really started to make it impossible for them to remain on the same list. And that is the question of joining a coalition. Now, Israel has never had an independent Arab party in a ruling coalition. When I say independent, back in the 60s, there were a couple of tiny satellite parties, which weren't really independent parties, but they were lists set up by what was then the Labour Party, try and bring in Arab voters because they wouldn't vote for Labour. So they kind of made a sort of proxy list, and which ran separately. So they were members of the coalition, but they weren't really independent parties.
They don't really count. Yeah, it's not an independent Arabic party.
People say that this time is the first time there's been an Arab party in the coalition, so it's not entirely accurate.
With Mansour Abbas, with one of the Arab lists.
Arab party. So what's really changed, and this is quite recent, is that in 2019, a new player came along, Mansour Abbas. Is a dentist and a lay preacher from the small town of Marar in the Galilee. And he was elected leader of Ram, of the Islamist party. And he came along with a new idea. He basically said, look, there are a lot of things that we won't solve. Are all the issues of Palestinian and Israeli identity, and is this the Jewish state, or is it a state for all its citizens, and who has the right to say this is this is a Jewish state or an Arab state or a Palestinian state, and what's going to happen with the occupation of the Palestinians in the West Bank and so on. All these things are, you say, I'm not saying these are not issues, but these are issues that we won't solve in the near future. And meanwhile, when we are permanently in opposition, we're not representing our voters. Now, our voters who live in Arab towns and villages have needs. They want better access to resources.
Yeah. So again, just to make the separation, he was saying that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, it's maybe something that you can put aside for now, because a lot of his voters are Israeli Arabs, right? I just want to make the distinction in the populations. Yeah.
When we say Israeli Arabs, that in itself is a term that is sometimes controversial, and every poll of Israeli Arabs asking what do they want to be called comes up with a different result, and more of them prefer being called Arab Israelis or Israeli Arab citizens or Israeli Palestinian citizens or Palestinian citizens of Israel, and so on. In general, we're talking about Palestinians who are Israeli citizens and therefore vote for the Knesset, unlike the Palestinians living in the West Bank and East Jerusalem and Gaza and so on. So basically, Mansour Abbas came along and said, we are going to have to put these really big, important issues of identity and occupation and so on aside, because it's going nowhere now. Nobody's negotiating. The Palestinians aren't in a position to negotiate. Their splits as well between Gaza and the West Bank, Fatah, Hamas, and all that. And meanwhile, we have very, very immediate needs for our community, which have to be addressed and can only be addressed if we get a say within the government. And therefore, and this is the bottom line, Mansour Abbas said, I want my party, Ra'am, or the United Arab List, to be part of a coalition. And you know what? I'll sit even in a right-wing coalition. I'll sit with Netanyahu. I don't care. I want to be in a coalition so I can be at the table and say, my community needs these things. We need funding. We need national projects for building, for infrastructure, for education.
And how did that work out?
Crime. So first of all, the idea, even before it happened, was so revolutionary that it tore apart the joint list. And Mansour Abbas in 2021 ran on its own. And then when he crossed the threshold, and that was kind of, people were saying he's not going to cross the threshold on his own. But it turned out that what he was proposing was attractive enough to enough Arab Israeli voters. Hold on just a second. I'm working to a deadline as well. I have to just answer a couple of questions.
No worries. I know we caught you just on the eve of the election, so I know there's probably a lot of pressing deadlines.
Yeah, I'm just authorizing a headline. Sorry.
No worries. We'll edit it out.
With you. So Mansour Abbas, first of all, proved that he can cross the electoral threshold with this message, with saying quite clearly that I am against, that I don't think that the Arab representatives need to remain forever in the opposition until God knows what they will solve the Israel-Palestine conflict. We need to go into the coalition now for the interests of our Arab voters. And he, despite splitting with the joint list, despite disappointing many of the Arab community who liked the idea of the joint list, they thought it was good that their representatives run together on one list instead of fighting each other. He still managed to cross the threshold. He still managed to cross the threshold and win 4 seats in the Knesset. Basically proving that this message is something a significant part of the Arab Israeli community was in favor. They are in favor of joining a coalition, something that the rest of the Arab Israeli parties couldn't really grasp for ideological reasons. And once he got in, he basically started negotiating with Netanyahu. And he said, actually, and this is the thing he said after that he was negotiating with Netanyahu in semi-secrecy. But he said, I would have preferred to sit with Netanyahu in a coalition because Netanyahu is the leader of the right wing. So if I would have sat in a coalition with him, this would have given a much broader legitimacy to me being, because he doesn't just want to be supported by his own constituency, by the Arab. He wants the broader Israeli society to accept the presence of Arab parties within the coalition. So he said, if Netanyahu would have said, okay, then the legitimacy would have been very wide. However, Netanyahu has partners. Those partners include the right-wing party, the far-right party we just mentioned now, led by Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich, and they vetoed any discussion between Netanyahu and Mansour Abbas. Mansour Abbas said, okay, I still want to sit in the coalition. When it sat down with Yair Lapid, and finally also sat down with Naftali Bennett, and after many weeks of wrangling, without going into all the details, they finally reached an agreement, and he joined the coalition. For the first time, Israel had, from June 2021 until right now, an Arab-Israeli party in the coalition. How well has that gone? They managed to pass in the Knesset a very hefty package of funding for lots of different infrastructure, social projects in the Arab sector. Most of these have yet to be fully implemented because there's only been a year, and it's not something that usually
still remains to be seen. Yeah, no, that's.
And I think one of the problems because this is a process, and I think Israeli politicians on both sides we're still only beginning to get used to the idea. It's still, there are many Arab Israeli voters who say this hasn't worked because they haven't seen results yet. And don't forget the joint list, which stayed out of the coalition and hate Mansour Abbas for splitting with them, have been sniping at him from day one, saying this isn't working. And
so he made new friends, but also new enemies, right? So-called.
Made many new enemies as well.
Many new enemies.
And it's much too early for him to say that he succeeded. Though we'll see tomorrow in the election. Maybe once again we'll see that more people than expected are still supporting Mansour Abbas. All left to be seen in the election. And meanwhile, this has also had a ripple effect on the other Arab parties. So the three parties that remained in the joint list in 2021, they are also have different ideas of the level to which a level of cooperation which is permissible with the government. So we mentioned the party before. So Balad, the nationalist.
Yeah. So the results are still remain. Yeah, the jury's still out.
As far as I'm concerned, the idea of any sort of cooperation with the government is terrible. It's a selling out of the Palestinian identity and can never be considered. While Chadash Ta'al, the two parties sort of in the middle,
bourgeoisie,
they're more ambivalent, let's say.
Yeah.
They're not headed to the coalition. They're still quite radical on that, but they're not as radical as Balad. They will probably consider some type of supporting the coalition on various issues without actually being members of the coalition. So that's another way in which this government could be formed after this election. But this was enough to exacerbate the tensions already within the joint list. So the joint list broke up entirely, and now we don't have the joint list anymore. The joint list has been disjointed, and we have three parties: Ra'am, already a member of the coalition; Chadash Ta'al, prepared to make some kind of dealings with the coalition, and Balad's no way. And since we'll come back again and again to this word, the threshold, since we have this threshold of 3.25%, and these three parties are splitting the Arab vote, there is a big question mark over which of these parties can actually win seats in the Knesset. If they don't win seats in the Knesset, the votes are lost and then redistributed, which is basically helping the Netanyahu bloc get closer and closer to its majority.
Yeah, so basically on both sides of the blocks, right, there's this danger of the bottom falling out and those smaller parties not making enough votes to cross the threshold, and then that block losing the mandates, right?
Yes, but the danger is much bigger on the anti-Netanyahu. Netanyahu has managed to keep his bloc much more concentrated. So his bloc, which is worth, let's say, potentially half of the Knesset, is just 4 lists. So all those lists are going to cross the threshold. then they may not be, the people within those lists may not be very happy being forced to be with each other. But Netanyahu has managed to keep his bloc tight, disciplined, and they're all going to cross the threshold, with the acceptance of one party led by Ayelet Shaked, which is sort of a rebel right-wing party, which are saying, well, we will support Netanyahu, but Netanyahu hates Ayelet Shaked. She was a partner of Naftali Bennett in the Yamina party, and there is a lot of bad blood there.
So we actually have a few.
So she will probably cost. She is unlikely to pass the threshold, and she'll probably cost Likud, the Netanyahu bloc, one seat. However, on the other side, on the center left, there are 4 or 5 parties. We mentioned the Arab parties. There's also Labour and Meretz, which are not doing very well. They're currently projected in the polls to cross the threshold.
So I have a question for you. How would you translate to English the word Gewalt, the Gewalt campaign?
Well, Gewalt is not a word in Hebrew.
Of course. As a lot of our listeners might know, because we do have a lot of Yiddish enthusiasts in the audience.
So I'm sure that you have some listeners whose Yiddish is better than mine, which is rather poor. Gewalt is a word which doesn't translate into Hebrew and English, or Hebrew or English very well. It kind of means beware, something is happening. But
vote for me, or I'm not going to make it, or we're going to drown. And
but it could actually be, but it could in some context mean something good is happening. But usually the context is something terrible is happening.
Yes.
And the Gewalt, it's a lot. Sorry. And since, even though my Yiddish is poor, I love that language. To me, it's a lovely thing that it's become such a feature of modern Israeli politics. The Gewalt campaign is when a party like Meretz sort of invented the Gewalt campaign, says, well, we may lose, we may not get 3.25% of the vote, and we will be wiped out. And if we're wiped out, without Meretz, what will happen?
The end of democracy, right?
Gewalt, save us.
Yes.
All you people and all you fickle left-wingers who you don't think we've been good enough and not pure enough and not we haven't delivered. You have to come home and save us. Sorry, you can't think that you can vote for someone else. And so I think it was Meretz who invented the Gewalt campaign already about 10 years ago in the 2013 or 2015 election. And that word has taken a life of itself in Israeli politics. And now it's basically any last minute campaign.
I just love to see it. It's also in the Hebrew press.
Today, when Netanyahu is saying, oh, we have to work very hard to boost turnout, the left wing have a higher turnout than us. So this is something does every single election. Now it's being called Bibi's Gewalt campaign. So the Gewalt
flip the switch on them,
has become a generic word for a last minute.
Call to arms.
It's like a Hail Mary kind of campaign.
A Hail Mary, that's a good one. Our audience will know that one. So actually, the segue for a lot of our audience into this discussion was the documentary film that I mentioned earlier in our conversation before we started recording. It's called King Bibi. It was released in 2018. The same time as your book, The Turbulent Times of Benjamin Netanyahu. And what surprised me in the film, and again, I'm Israeli and I grew up having Netanyahu as my prime minister for most of my life in Israel, was really the deep connection to, the US, the American culture. He grew up here for several years, went to high school in Philadelphia, very famously graduated from MIT and started his political career here in New York at the UN. So I'm wondering what part of his journey, in his connection to America played into his politics and the way that he runs things, even up to this day.
So let me just say a really quick word about the relationship between my book, which is called Bibi, the Turbulent Times of Benjamin Netanyahu, and King Bibi, Dan Shadur's documentary. So we were both working at the same time, researching, and I was writing and he was producing. And somehow at one point someone introduced us, and we began having kind of meetings, and so anybody who's worked in in producing documentaries and everyone who's written a book knows they're very different processes. With writing a book, you have a lot more. You can put a lot more in a book than you can put in an hour in a movie, which is an hour or whatever. And so I kind of had the luxury as a writer to bring a lot more aspects to what I was doing, whereas Dan, the director of King Bibi, he had to choose, what's his theme, and I think he made a brilliant choice, and it's something you can only really do with a visual media, is to show, he does it so well, to show how Netanyahu basically built his on-screen persona, his incredible mastery of television and of appearing on stage and talking to audiences. And I touch on that in my book, but obviously you bring it a lot better. That specific aspect is much better when you can actually show rather than tell. And I really love it because I've watched it so many times, and I feel that we had this kind of dialogue between us. And what it shows, and you see what Bibi brought from America. Bibi brought from America a lot of things. This is somebody who, not by his own choice, lived most of his teens in the United States, mainly in Philadelphia. Even before that, at the age of eight or nine, they spent 2 years in America, living for 1 year in Manhattan, another year in Long Island. So nearly half of his childhood until graduation from high school was spent, certainly the main years of high school was spent in the US. And at the time, his father had basically moved to the US because he didn't have Benjamin Netanyahu, professor of history, didn't have the kind of academic success he thought that was his due in Israel. So he moved to America, and where he'd already done his PhD, and then he moved between different institutes. At one point, he was at the University of Denver. Then, for his perspective, his height, because he was a massive snob, so he thought Ivy League is like so great. So the fact that he became a professor at Cornell in his 60s for him was the peak. So his parents were living in the US basically from the mid 60s until the 80s. So Bibi, his life was in between, and then he went to the army in 18, went back to Israel, spent 5 years in the army. But his family had this kind of inflated idea of American education, higher education being so great that he couldn't study in Israel. He had to go and study in America. So he went to MIT, and then he spent the time at the Boston Consulting Group, went back to Israel, didn't do very well in business, and then in a really lucky break, got offered a job, a very senior diplomatic job at the embassy in Washington, and then became the ambassador to the UN. So until the time he finished his time at the UN, we was 36 at the time, he had spent nearly half his life in the US, and so many formative years. He spent his high school, he went to college or university, and then the first years of his public career was as an Israeli diplomat based in Washington and New York. So, first of all, on a personal level, that obviously made him who he is, and I write in my book about how you've got like the American Bibi and the Israeli Bibi, and at the same time he kept up his Israeli-ness very strong. He did not. I mean, the best example is in high school. He didn't really make many friends, and the moment the school year ended, he was on a plane to Israel. He didn't spend a day of summer vacation in America. He actually spent the entire school year working in the evenings, working tables, so he would have the money for the airfare. He bought himself the ticket every year to fly back. So he went his real friends were the friends he spent 2 months every summer with back in Israel. His friends who had been with him at school before he left for Philadelphia. And it was very clear that there were two sides of Netanyahu, and he managed to, he could compartmentalize and be the American kid, an honest student in high school in Philadelphia, and be Bibi back at home, going off on hikes and work weeks at kibbutzim and so on. And the moment school ended, the moment he graduated, he didn't stay for graduation or anything like that. There's literally in the file of his high school year, there's at the end of the file, there's a piece of paper with the names of the students who graduated but were not at the graduation ceremony. And he's on the list.
Includes Benjamin Netanyahu. If only they knew.
Back in Israel, getting ready to join the IDF. But what did he bring as a politician? He brought two things. One thing is what you see in King Bibi, in the movie, is he brought the art of appearing on television, of being interviewed and so on. Now, anybody who is mid-40s and upwards remembers that back in the 80s, in the early 80s, and first of all, television was one channel, black and white. You had a bit of news, and nobody really knew how to perform on television, certainly not politicians. Politics then the campaigning was done in street rallies and making speeches.
So it was kind of like the Kennedy-Nixon moment, the Kennedy moment, just 20 years later.
No question that in the 1996 Paris Bibi debate was basically a rerun of Kennedy-Nixon, and Netanyahu spent his years as a diplomat, but even before that, as a student in debating classes and so on, learning the kind of things that at the time were totally foreign to Israeli politicians. But at the same time, a younger generation of Israelis who were watching television, were watching movies, and perhaps some of them had traveled abroad, for them, the fact that there was an Israeli politician, a young Israeli politician, first of all, he had been at the UN and he'd been a great debater at the UN, a great speech maker, and he'd been a star on the American networks, and not just the networks, print media treated him with like he was young royalty. And when CNN was launched, he was a star there. And there was Ted Koppel's Nightline in the 1980s. He was a frequent guest. All these things together, and Dan shows us in the movie in King Bibi how Bibi got better at it all the time, how he worked it. And there's a wonderful moment, which I was really interested in when I saw the first time King Bibi. It's a moment in 1982 when Bibi had just arrived in Washington as a deputy ambassador. It was during the Lebanon War, and this was a period when the American administration at the time was the Reagan administration, was nowhere near as supportive of Israel as it is today. And there was a lot of pressure coming from the Reagan administration on Israel to kind of scale back its campaign in Lebanon at the time. And there is and I write about this in the book, but I didn't see it until I saw it on Dan's movie, that there was a moment when Bibi was called into the State Department, and he was given some kind of reprimand or something. He was a young diplomat, and there was a guy called Lawrence Eagleburger, who was the Deputy Secretary of State, and one of these like very respectable and veteran American diplomats. He was basically tearing him a new one. And then there's a camera outside the State Department. Bibi comes out, and this is Bibi, who doesn't look that different than he looks today, even though this is 40 years ago. He was already silver haired, and he looked like this is Bibi, but it's not Bibi like you've ever seen him. He comes out, he's unprepared, his tie is crooked, he's perspiring, he's not, and he's kind of caught in the camera glare like a rabbit in the lights, and he hasn't got anything prepared to say. And we've all seen Netanyahu so many times over the decades. This is a man who's always got a soundbite ready. He knows exactly what the message he wants to give to the camera. He knows how to look at the camera. He knows how to speak to the interviewer. Nobody's better than him at this, not just in Israel, anywhere. Yeah,
so it sounds like he learned his lesson there, right?
Yeah, he learned his lesson right there. And like I say, I describe this in the book, but Dan shows it. And you see that moment. That to me is one of the most powerful moments in the King Bibi movie, and all the viewers who've watched already, those who haven't yet, that I think they'll see that this is a moment that suddenly Bibi understands. Hold on, I am now in America. Television here is what decides. And he and other people around him said at the time, he decided, he understood that as a young diplomat from a small country, the way that he could build himself up, and the way that the Americans who came into contact with him would treat him with respect was if he shows that he's a good performer on television. And he made that into his goal. He saw that as an end to itself. And even though many of us will say, well, that's just being empty, this is, there are more important things. There's substance. There's not just how well you speak on the television. He did quite well.
Did quite well. I would agree with that statement. So I just want to tie everything back in, and just because we have just a few more minutes. So going back to the article that you published today, you mentioned, and the article and the headline just sums it up perfectly. The headline that probably the publication gave to the article is Israel will never escape Netanyahu. And basically the point that you make in the article, right, is that it's not just that he's a proven winner, is more than that, is his longevity and his tenacity and his ability to come back from setbacks and come back from losses and all of that. And just to make kind of an equivalence with Donald Trump and those types of characters. And we just saw in Brazil, there was the elections where Bolsonaro just lost to Lula. Is that something that could happen, again, with Bibi, with Trump, the fact that they're going to be able to kind of recover, take their losses and move forward from that?
Well, the American system is more difficult this because you do have term limits, and there's not a president. There's no precedent of a president losing and then coming back again, which happened in Israel before Netanyahu came. Rabin came, and so on. But there are two things that are really unique about Netanyahu. Perhaps not unique in the sense that they do not exist amongst other politicians, but with Netanyahu, they exist in abundance, infinite. And one is that Netanyahu wakes up in the morning, he's campaigning. Now, not just now.
Yeah.
He doesn't stop campaigning when the campaign is officially over, even if he's won. If he's already planning the next campaign, he's a constant campaigner. He wants to convince any audience he's speaking to, and he's thinking of the next election, whenever it may be. And he's not thinking at any point of retirement. And if he loses, and people say Netanyahu's a winner, that's not true. If you look at his track record, he's had plenty of losses and ties. But especially in the last five elections, but he's never a quitter. He will never ever say, okay, I lost this election, now I've got to think why the people rejecting me, and I've got to leave politics and do something else. And he's 73, we said, he's not retiring. I've got to, some politicians, even when they succeed, they think, we're going to start preparing a successor. He's never prepared a successor. Anybody who had the hint of being a successor was immediately kicked out. And that's so Netanyahu really has this energy that I haven't seen with any other politician in Israel or abroad, to continue coming back. And just think, who were the politicians? Netanyahu became prime minister the first time in 1996. So who are the people around that? Bill Clinton, Tony Blair, Helmut.
A lot of politicians who are far gone.
Some of them are dead, and some of them are long retired.
Yes.
Netanyahu was there before Obama came along, and he's there after Obama's left.
Outlasted, for sure.
When Netanyahu became prime minister, Donald Trump was still a New York real estate guy, and there's actually I don't know if you noticed in King Bibi, there's this moment when Bibi goes to New York for the first time after he becomes prime minister, and you see Trump at some gathering that they in Bibi's honor.
Yeah.
One of the tables at the back of the restaurant. So he's been there for so long, and he's going nowhere. He will cut. So when he loses and everybody says he's finished, he comes back and he buries everyone. So that's one thing. He has this energy to do this. He's been doing this from his 30s, he's 73, he's doing it for 40 years. God knows when if he's ever gonna give up. His dad, Professor Benjamin Netanyahu, lived to 102, and he was still researching and writing well into his 90s. I would not predict when Netanyahu will ever give up. But that's about the energy. The sheer
Yeah,
there is something beyond that. Now, once again, this is something that other politicians have as well, but nowhere near like Netanyahu. Politicians, national politicians, those who have served as prime ministers and presidents, often have this kind of feeling that their lives and destinies are the nation's destiny, and what's good for them is good for the nation, and whoever's threatening their nation and so on. We've
that's
seen that with Trump and others. It also happens to nice liberal politicians as well. There is this ego trip in being a prime minister. Most of us will never be in that position where we have this power over an entire nation. But Netanyahu not only feels that, and this is something he really learned from his father, he is convinced that not only is he the best leader for Israel, he's convinced that he's the only leader who can avoid a terrible calamity happening. And if he's not leading Israel, Israel is on the path, on the slippery slope to a terrible existential crisis, if not destruction. So Bibi gets up in the morning, he's campaigning and he's fighting. He's not just fighting an election, he's fighting for Israel's survival. That is what he believes. And people think, oh, he's just putting on a show when he talks about Iran and he talks about the threats to Israel. No, he has convinced himself. He believes that. And he is convinced that still at the age of 73, not just because he's old, but because he has so much experience, then the idea of replacing him when Israel is constantly under existential threat, the idea of replacing him is a threat to national security. How could you ever find somebody with his abilities and his incredible gifts and his experience? So, and you speak to many Israelis, they believe it as well. They think,
so it's interesting because
people say to me when I go to Likud rallies, and not necessarily people who are crazy, you say, we've been blessed by God. We have this guy. Look at him. Look how he's respected around the world. Look what he's done. Look at his record. How on God's earth can Israel allow itself to allow such a man not to be its leader?
So it's interesting because one of the audience questions that we received from somebody who seems well versed in the Israeli political discourse, one of our audience members wrote to us, if Bibi becomes prime minister, is that the end of pluralistic democracy in Israel as we know it? And to me, what it sounds like, you wouldn't bet against Netanyahu on the polls. It sounds like he's still going to be there, but it doesn't sound like it's the end of the democratic game or anything like that anytime soon, right?
Well, I really haven't got a good answer here because, first of all, I can't predict.
Mm-hmm.
And Netanyahu has in the past he's done stuff which has sort of eroded Israeli democracy, but he hasn't gone all the way. He hasn't gone, the way like, for example, Orban in Hungary has done, or Bolsonaro tried, or Trump tried to do. But as he gets
hasn't
older,
gone all the way in.
But as he gets older, he's getting more and more authoritarian, more inclined to break the rules. And we've seen that in the campaigns in recent years. And we talked about how he brought in the far right, the Jewish power. This is not something he would have done in the past. This is not something Likud did in the past. So, is this the end of Israel's pluralistic democracy? Question is, how pluralistic was Israeli democracy to begin with? But I cannot predict. Put it this way, the fact that I can't predict, the fact that a few years ago I was said, nah, Bibi's not going to go that far. Now I just can't rule it out. So okay, so
to limit your prediction powers, just until tomorrow morning, any hunch, any gut feelings?
It's really, really close. It's not me saying, it's the pollsters saying that. In the last polls, Israel has like a 3-day period in which we can't publish polls. The last polls we had were over the weekend. Had him on an average of 60. So 60 is not enough. But
60-60, 50-50 in the Knesset, right?
The margin here between victory and failure is tiny. It's a hair's breadth, and it could happen not because of him doing very well, but because one of the Arab parties or Meretz does worse than expected. So nobody's betting this. Okay, I made a couple of bets with friends and meals because that's the kind of you do. But there is no way to predict. No pollster is making any serious prediction right now. The Israeli election, because of the proportional representation system, especially this time with so many small parties, it's like a big machine with so many small parts moving within it, and each part, if it moves slightly wrong, it can blow up the engine. And that's where we are now, where it could blow up in any direction. Bibi could tomorrow night be once again the comeback kid, never count Bibi out, and no one messes with Bibi. Or it could be, yet again he's failed and the serial failure, and he's lost it, and he'll never again. And the distance between those two outcomes is paper thin.
As always, thank you for.
We're on a knife's edge, to use another cliche, and I will not predict, certainly not publicly, which way it's going to go.
Fantastic. And one last question. Actually, this is something that some of our audience might not be aware. As opposed to the United States, Elections Day in Israel is a day off. It's a national holiday. So any plans for after casting your vote?
Not for journalists. No, I'm working very hard tomorrow.
Of course, I'm sure you will.
I'd love one election day to take off, but sadly I can't. I'm not yet.
Maybe after Bibi retires.
Maybe after Bibi retires, I'll retire as well. Who knows?
Exactly. Well,
right now,
thank you very much.
Right now, it looks like he'll be doing it for after I retire as well.
Exactly. Well, thank you very much, Anshel, for tuning in and giving us some of your time today. I know it's a very busy season, and best of luck to all of us. And we'll stay tuned for the election results tomorrow. I encourage all of our audience to watch King Bibi documentary, to go to the nearest bookstore and buy Anshel's book as well.
There's a little website. It's called Amazon. You may have heard of it.
Yeah, I've heard about it. And this American thing, right? So thank you again for your time.
Good to be.
All right. Bye. Thank you very much, Anshel.
Okay.
Yeah, perfect. תודה רבה. אחלה. ערב טוב.